Hello, everyone, and welcome to Writing For Roleplay, a tabletop RPG podcast. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Kayla.
Thank you for listening into our podcast. Our first episode today is going to be telling you about why we're doing this podcast.
It's a session 0, baby!
That's right. You always need to start out with a session 0 so you can lay out the foundation, you can set the expectations, you can get to know each other. That's one of the best things to do when working on a role-playing campaign. So, Writing for Roleplay. Just as the title says, this podcast is going to be talking about crafting narratives in tabletop RPGs. Whether you are a GM at the table, whether you are a player creating your character, whether you are adapting an existing module, or whether you are writing a whole cloth module yourself, maybe even professionally. We are also going to be talking with other people in the TTRPG industry who also talk about the TTRPGs that we love to play. There's quite a lot of ground to cover in this podcast. Kayla, did I miss anything?
I keep getting stuck on TTRPG, and I think I'm going to mess it up every time I say it because it's such a tongue twister.
It is an imperfect acronym, but the industry has yet to find a better one. Because like, RPG could be, you know, like a video game. Like, Fallout is an RPG.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like LARP.
Yeah, or LARP.
See, LARP is nice and easy to say. We need a LARP. Maybe we call it TARP.
TARP? Tabletop
TARP.
Action Role-Playing?
Yeah.
I could get behind that.
The A, yeah, so we're here to talk about TARPs,
Yes.
and we're coming in hot with a new acronym for y'all. Welcome to 2024. We're switching things up. TARPing has been a thing since at least the 70s, if not sooner, possibly. I'm not sure. Kevin's the expert. I'm here to talk about playing.
Yeah, let's introduce ourselves real quick, because there's probably quite a few people listening into our podcast who don't know who we are and why we're qualified to talk about what we're talking about.
I like that you are assuming that everybody listening right now, well, I guess eventually other people that aren't in our party will listen.
That's the beauty of like recorded media, is that we'll put this out there, and then for the most part, you know, people starting out won't know who we are. But then there will be people in the future who, you know, like see like, oh, hey, these guys have won Oscars. Let's see like where they began, and then they come.
I like this timeline.
Yeah, a man can dream. So real quick, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Kevin Carpenter. I am a forever GM. I've played a ton of different tabletop RPGs. I also work in the tabletop RPG industry. I've written games for small companies like Rocket Pig Games and Son of Oak Game Studio, and I've also created quite a bit of videos and social media content for these companies as well. You may actually know me from my work with Son of Oak Game Studio and creating a bunch of videos for their games like City of Mist or Otherscape, but I've also worked with companies like Tabletop Vacations, Evil Genius Games, and now I am working with our own brand, our own launch, our own startup, Digital Kaiju Studios. And if you need an acronym for that, DKS.
I like that I could hear when you went into your like DM presentery mode that you use for certain NPCs. It was like a light switch. I'm Kayla Knudsen. I work in the television industry. I am a player. I've been playing with Kevin since like 2018, I think it was.
Something like that,
2019?
yeah.
No, 2019. Since 2019.
It was definitely pre-pandemic.
So I've been playing. Yeah, we've been playing together since 2019, which Kevin was not my first D&D party. Well, the first D&D party was the 3.5e one that went swimmingly. If anybody in that party is listening to this, you guys are great. It was just, we were all new. Disclaimer, it was a brand new thing, but y'all were great. Matt, you tried your best. I respect that. So yeah, I am a player. I've been playing with Kevin since 2019. That was also when I started playing regularly RPGs, mostly D&D, but I've played some other ones. I have a background in comedy and improv a little bit, so that's sort of how I approach tabletop RPGs, and we'll get into that more as we go on.
You're bearing the lead on some of your other credentials. What was like the most prominent show that you actually? Can you talk about the show that you were working for previously, or?
Yeah, I was support staff in the writers' room on the iCarly reboot. Was the biggest one where I had any sort of even little creative input. I say that like I didn't pitch jokes all the time. I don't remember how many jokes made it to screen because you don't keep score like that necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But there were jokes that I pitched that made it to screen, and I did help in the writer's room breaking story in some of the smaller rooms. But it was, I don't want to come out here and be like, yeah, I was like the head writer on iCarly. I worked for the head writer on iCarly, the showrunner. I was the showrunner's assistant. So I was in the room a lot, learning and then contributing to breaking story. But yeah, I'm not a WGA member yet, though.
But that's what's I find interesting about like this dynamic, and the main reason I wanted to do a podcast with you, especially Kayla, is I'm coming at this from a forever GM who works in the TTRPG industry angle, and you're coming at this from a player at the table who works in the traditional television industry angle. And part
Yeah.
of what we're going to be talking about in this podcast, I say part like it isn't going to be the main thing we're going to talk about, is
Mm-hmm.
how crafting a narrative in a tabletop RPG has so many layers.
Well, I think the thing too about coming from traditional media and spending a lot of time in that space, which is very structured, character driven, etc., is that when I am crafting characters, I don't really see a difference between crafting a character for a television show, like a main character in a TV show or a movie, and then crafting your character in a tabletop RPG. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's the same thing. And I understand that the mediums are different, and one is very much made for an audience, and one is made primarily for the people sitting at the table, actual plays notwithstanding. But I don't approach it differently. It's all the same to me. It's all character work. It's all motivations and flaws and things like that.
And that's the interesting thing is like when you're crafting narratives for a tabletop RPG, you do have to keep the, traditional rules and building blocks of like linear narrative, in your head. Characters, motivation, climax, resolution, buildup of action, like all of this different stuff. But at the same time, the unique nature of how tabletop RPGs are played, where it's, from the player angle, you're not just playing a video game that can only interact with you within certain programmed parameters. You are playing a game that responds directly to you, usually through the focal point of the dungeon master. Of course, there are solo
Mm-hmm.
RPGs where the rules get a little bit more hazy there, but that's kind of the traditional model that we're looking at for the most part here.
Yeah.
And then from the GM angle, you can have an idea of the story beats that you want to hit. You can definitely have an idea for like, all right, I want the campaign to start here, and then I want the campaign to end here. But you can't control the main characters. The people, the protagonists who are driving the action, you have no control over. So you have to craft your
Yeah.
narrative with that in mind. And then you with that in mind, you kind of have to take some of the storytelling rules from like other mediums like video games, because crafting a narrative for a tabletop RPG is in part game design. Actually, it's a large part
Yeah,
game design.
absolutely. Well, and it's also, I mean, the thing too is, you can't control the players ultimately, but there is a bit of herding cats that you
Mm-hmm.
need to do. And so it is a collaboration between the players and the DM, of the DM putting down signals and prompts and guardrails, sort of, and the players need to recognize that and pick up on that. And that's where screenwriting comes into factor, because every time you write a beat in a story, it needs to lead to the character making the only choice they could make. Like
Mm-hmm.
every choice that a character makes is the only choice that they could make, and it's not because the character is it's not because the character is being shepherded by the writer. It's because the character could only make that choice. It's what's truest to the character in that moment. And so you have to work together to get to the end like that.
Mm-hmm. I love the way you phrase that. This is the only choice the character can make, because there's a prominent thing in tabletop RPG campaigns where players rail against the practice of railroading. But railroading isn't, you only have one option in this instance. Railroading is the GM is only giving you one option that does not make sense for you.
Yeah.
And there is there is that relationship between, like, okay, there is a measure of buy-in that, you come in with this, but also, like, I think a prominent thing with railroading is when you, like, make an action and the world doesn't respond to it, because
exactly
it's only going to respond to this set of actions. And you have to keep that in mind. That is, like, you're crafting this narrative and you have an idea of how these characters are going to react. And you can set up, like, here's a treasure map. Here's the big X where the treasure is. Here's the dragon guarding the treasure. And you have a greater idea of, like, these are the, the beats I'm going to hit. They're going to go after the treasure. They're going to fight the dragon, and they're going to take the treasure. But maybe the main characters go in through a back door. Maybe the main characters talk to the dragon instead. Maybe they figure out that it's like, hey, if this dragon is evil because it's hoarding wealth, and the king wants all the wealth for himself so he can hoard, well, what's the difference between the dragon and the king? Maybe we should go kill the king, and then that's a great D&D campaign right there.
Yeah. The thing with railroading, I think sometimes people misuse it, as you've mentioned, and I don't play RPGs because I just want to do whatever. If I wanted to do whatever, I'd go sit down and write a novel and see where that takes me. I want to see what you've made. I love pressing. You throw up buttons and traps and things all the time. And I come down to the table, I sit down, and I'm like, what has Kevin got in store for us tonight? And usually it is suffering. And then, we spend 3 hours screaming at the table in the best way possible. You are all agreeing to tell a story together. So players that like to come in and they take great pride in derailing the campaign or breaking what the DM has in store in a way that is destructive. I mean, because I've broken in some aspects before. I've kind of, quote unquote, broken what you've laid out for us in some ways, but not in a, like, destructive way, just in a, I've made a surprise choice. I found an option. You presented it. You thought maybe there was door 1 and door 2, and I found door 3.
Yeah.
With a very good skill roll check by luck and using the things that you've already given us. Making a surprising choice and switching things up is not derailing, but derailing also isn't fun. You don't want to it's a collaborative game. You don't want to hold a game hostage to cause absolute chaos. That's no fun. Again, you have to be wanting to work with other people. It's a social game.
And that's the main rub. Like, no matter what aspects of crafting narratives we talk about, at the end of the day, the main thing to keep in mind when thinking about this is collaboration. Mm-hmm. Tabletop RPGs are collaborative narratives at their core. And, throughout this podcast, we're going to be thinking of all the different layers of that, whether it's the GM and the players at the table who are actively playing the game with each other, whether it's you are writing a module for other people to pick up, and then you have to think about, like, all the possibilities while you're writing it, or another thing that is sort of attached to this space, whether you're doing an actual play.
Yeah.
For those who are not aware of what actual plays are, and I imagine if you're listening to this podcast, you have an understanding, but just in case, actual plays are when people stream their tabletop RPG games. And so you can watch that collaborative narrative unfold, similar to, Critical Role, Dimension 20, The Adventure Zone, all this different stuff. And when you look at it at that level, suddenly there's a whole new layer of narrative.
Oh, yeah. And a disclaimer for everybody whose introduction to tabletop role-playing games are through actual plays, because that was my reintroduction. I got back into D&D. I gave D&D and role-playing games a second chance because I watched Critical Role when the second campaign premiered, and I was like, oh, this is what it can be. If you go into your game with a bunch of friends or with a bunch of strangers at the game store, if you go into your first game expecting it to be Dimension 20 or Critical Role or NADPOD or whichever actual play you've seen, don't.
Yeah.
Because these people are often professional writers and actors. And again, that, you know, this is why Hollywood loves RPGs, because we've all been in writers' rooms, we've all been in plays, we have background in improv. It blends very well. They're coming in with a level of professional expertise to this game that you are not bringing, and they are coming into this to make entertainment for an audience that isn't at the table. You need to approach, in my opinion, you should approach your game at the table with your friends as a game at the table with your friends, rather than, you know, I'm going to come out and it's going to be like super cinematic and I expect everybody to do all these different voices and I expect it to be just like Critical Role or just like Dimension 20. No, don't do that. You're going to set yourself up for failure because, again, and the other thing too is like those players, you know, Matt Mercer and Brennan Lee Mulligan have been playing since they were in high school, I think, or even younger. And I mean, I didn't play in high school. I was a theater kid in high school, so, you know, there was some of that, but I wasn't playing RPGs. Yeah, you played in high school.
Yeah.
So it like so I was a little bit, I mean, I've played with other people who were not as experienced as you, so that was a lesson I learned really quickly of like, oh, and like I said, the first game I played was a mess, and I didn't even have any expectations based off of actual plays. And then when I watched Critical Role and then I played with my friends, I had to learn like, oh, right, we are not all professional voice actors who have been playing for several years. We haven't even, I mean, and when Critical Role came out, they had all been playing together for a while. So they could make choices with each other that I could not make, even with my friends that I had been friends with for years. I had to learn how to play a game like this with them because it was different than just being friends. Like, you have to be, the way that you want to play the game may not be the way that your friend of 10 years wants to play the game, and you're going to have to kind of learn about that. And we met through playing RPGs. Like, that was how our friendship started. So it's been very serendipitous that we like to play the same games because we started by playing the games and then we became friends through the games. But yeah, you gotta go in with very measured expectations, I think, if your introduction is with actual plays. And if your introduction is with actual plays too, you might be super heavy on the role play aspect of it. That might be what really draws you into it. And I think sometimes D&D can be a bit crunchy. So, you know, maybe explore other options as well. There's lots of great TTRPGs that are more rules light and more roleplay heavy and stuff, and we'll get into that.
Oh no, our next episode is literally just going to be talking
literally
about, like,
the next episode we're going to talk about systems and genre and all of that. So
yeah, we're going to be talking about genre. We're going to be talking main point. There are other games besides Dungeons and Dragons. You bring up an incredibly good point where a lot of people get their intro through the space, not even through playing Dungeons and Dragons, but like watching other people play Dungeons and Dragons. And it's
so no 5-year-old kid or 10-year-old kid, I didn't play a lot of sports when I was a child. No child watches Major League Baseball on TV and then walks out onto the t-ball field expecting it to be like the Diamondbacks versus Yankees 2001 World Series. They go out there expecting to have a good time. So you can't watch professional D&D players killing it in so many respects and then come at your table and expect it to be the exact same thing. Just go in trying to have as much fun as possible and focus on the game that you're actually playing at the table instead of all of the games you've seen in your head.
Yeah. And that's a big thing is DMs like Matt Mercer and Brennan Lee Mulligan, you know, Critical Role and Dimension 20, they're getting paid to do this, and they are crafting a narrative for a different audience. They're crafting a narrative on another layer because they are presenting their games to an audience. In actual plays, you have the narrative of the story of the game itself, and then you have the meta narrative of the players at the table. And that's why a lot of people watch actual plays, is because they like the players at the table and they like seeing their dynamics as they're playing this game. But the DMs have to keep in mind, like, you know, okay, I'm not just making a fun game for the players here. I am making an interesting story for the people at home. I have to keep my game under like 2.5 hours or 3 hours or however long, you know, they edit it for. but their goals of narrative crafting are on a different layer than the goals of a GM at a casual table, or the goals of a player at the table, or the goals of someone writing a module. And a lot of people come into this hobby watching these games, seeing these professional dungeon masters, and then being like, well, if I can't play a game at this level, then, I shouldn't play. It's like, no, you should definitely get into playing TTRPGs. Sit down at the table, have 10 other players around the table, have a jolly bad time, and then have fun with it because you're playing a game.
Matt Mercer and Brennan Lee's Mulligan's first games when they were like 12 or whatever were not what Critical Role and Dimension 20 are currently.
Yeah.
And I know before anybody comes in the comments to be like, well, Matt Mercer also always says in interviews, like, my first focus is just crafting a game and a story that's fun for my friends and my players. I don't necessarily worry about the audience that much. He's still a professional who has had decades of experience and is a professional writer and actor. You may not be. So, that your game is going to be a little bit different, and you have to just throw caution to the wind, have fun, lean in, jump in. And again, don't worry about, all of the games haunting you in your head of like, I think it needs to be this or that, And that being said, disclaimer, by the way, we are Dimension 20 Critical Role fans. Yeah. Like, to be very clear. I am currently, I started with Critical Role. I still keep up with Critical Role. I've currently been going through Dimension 20. Of the actual plays I have seen, though, if there was one GM that I would say, actually, you should try and emulate this GM, I would say that Abria Iyengar is an excellent example for beginning GMs, because I think, and for beginning players, because I find her DM style to be very, not like loose, but she really does lean into like rule of cool, into sort of she's a little bit more of a relaxed GM, I think. When I watched her Critical Role EXU, I loved it because I saw her GM style and I was like, oh, okay, I could GM maybe, because she made it seem so approachable. And she's a fantastic GM. This isn't me saying like, oh, she's not as good of a GM as Brennan and Matt, or she's not as strict, or she's not as role-playing. She's incredible. She's incredibly layered. She's a fantastic GM. She has a distinct and different style from them, though, that I found very approachable as somebody, like, for my own personality and play style. So I'm just saying, like, don't think that your GM needs to be Matt or Brennan, or that you need to be Matt or Brennan. You need to find your own style. Mm-hmm. It's okay to like steal what you like from them, but yeah, don't be afraid to be yourself.
Yeah, and honestly, thesis of the podcast right there. There is a lot of different excuses and hangups that people have that keep them from entering this hobby. And a lot of times it's, I don't like Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that's the only tabletop RPG out there, or I'm not going to be at the same level as these professional, like voice actors, or I'm scared of like running my first campaign and it's sucking and everyone hating me. Look, we're doing a Writing for Roleplay podcast. We're going to give you advice on getting into the game and crafting a narrative. But here's the biggest piece of advice. Get the game, get some friends, have a fun time. You're going to be bad, you're going to be good. You don't have to be professional level quality.
It's just like any other skill. You got to suck until you get good at it.
Mm-hmm. But listen to our podcast and we'll give you a lot of advice on how to sort of make that on-ramp a little smoother. We'll tell you about some of the mistakes that we've made in our gaming past, and maybe you can learn from them, or maybe you have to do those mistakes yourself in order to learn from them. That's just kind of how life works. But another beautiful thing about tabletop RPGs, one more thing I kind of want to add to this sort of intro episode, is that the industry is still relatively young. I think in terms of like comparisons here, like the tabletop RPG industry to the movie industry, like tabletop RPGs are kind of still in their black and white era. Like I think we've just gotten to like color television, maybe.
It's literally about half the age of movies. Yeah. If we put movies in the 1910s, really, TTRPG started in the 70s, and Hollywood didn't really get very interesting until the 70s. That's my hot take. So we are just now getting to the point where TTRPGs are starting to get really interesting and really exploratory because they've had the time to build that foundation and set the scene and get rolling and rolling.
Yeah.
And now we're at the point where, you know, a lot of people are really interested in it. It's become so much more accessible. You're getting just an insane amount of growth and creativity happening. And we're in the 70s of TTRPGs. As 70s cinema was to TTRPGs, I think that's what we're in right now.
Oh, yeah.
I think one day Quentin Tarantino's got this. We are not sponsored by Quentin Tarantino, but Quentin Tarantino has a book out, Cinema Speculation, all about how the cinema of the 70s influenced him. So I think in like 30 years, we're going to get some big TTRPG kid who's, you know, in high school right now, taking all of this in and watching all of these actual plays and playing all of these different games. And then they're going to write a retrospective in 30 or 40 years all about the late 2010s and the 2020s and what that did to TTRPG.
And it's interesting because there is quite a bit of history to tabletop RPGs too. Enough history that there's bits of it still clinging on to the hobby. Like, you know, how many...
better or worse.
For better or worse, yeah. Like, how many people have gone into a game of Dungeons & Dragons expecting a sort of, like, light, goofy, Dimension 20 style romp, and then their DM is a grognard who played back in the meat grinder days. And it's like, all right, you guys are going through a dungeon, there's a vampire in this room, and then the next attack he drops you. Make a new character. Like...
Yeah, I mean, the roleplay part where we take roleplay to mean improvise-based, you know, character work and emotional storytelling, that's somewhat new. I mean, D&D's foundation is very much dungeon crawl strategy.
And before that, war games.
Yeah, the culture was trying to kill your players as much as possible. It was making it, like, really, really hard. And I enjoy dungeon crawl. I enjoy meat grinder. I'll be honest. I like the strategy based of it. I know I ragged on math nerds earlier, as if I wasn't also in advanced math. But I like that part. But yeah, the roleplay aspects of TTRPGs, we're just now kind of getting into that more emotional storytelling, I think, in the last few years especially. Not to say that there hasn't been games previous to the late 2010s and the 2020s, previous to 5e, etc., that had heavy role playing. But again, the popularity of it is in the last few years exploding.
Speaking of 5e, there was something from the foreword of the D&D 5e adventure Curse of Strahd that sticks with me. And I think it will stick to this podcast in a way. So the foreword was from the original creator of the Castle Ravenloft module, like back in like the D&D 1e or 2e days. And they were basically talking about how they were playing classic Dungeons and Dragons and they were going through a dungeon crawl. And at one point they enter a room and a vampire is there. And it immediately took them out of the game because there was no reason for the vampire to be there. And after they played the session, you know, the person writing this forward was like, they were just caught up in it. They were just like, why is the vampire there? There should be a reason that there is a vampire there. This is just a random vampire in the middle of this dungeon. What's going on? And that inspired them to go create the original Strahd von Zarovich D&D modules that have since been remade over and over again through all the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons. We talk about how history still clings to this industry as we move forward in it. But it's just fascinating that it's like this really cool piece of like our industry's history was literally founded off of someone being like, what is the story?
That is so interesting. That it was just like some one-off little... If it wasn't a vampire, if it was like an illithid or something, we wouldn't have Curse of Strahd, which is... Yeah. I mean, we're playing Curse of Strahd right now. Kevin's run it a few times. I'm playing through it for the first time as a player, and I have to say, it fucks. It is... it's a cool module. Don't play it for your first module. Do not play Curse of Strahd as your first module if you're a new player. Playing with a bunch of new people, I wouldn't recommend it because it's a little bit of a meat grinder, and it's just I think you should play something else and kind of get a bit more experience and used to it before you dive into Curse of Strahd. But if you have some play hours under your belt and you're thinking about your next module and you do want to play a D&D module, I would recommend Curse of Strahd. Not sponsored.
Yeah, not sponsored, not sponsored.
We're not sponsored by Wizards of the Coast or anybody right now at this moment, but, you know, hey, what's up? If you own a RPG game company and you want to sponsor us, like, DMs are open, digitalkaijustudios@gmail.com. What's up?
Speaking of how to contact us, by the way, be sure to check out our social media. You can follow us there. We got links in the show notes. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content stuff like extra episodes and access to our private Discord server where you can talk to us as well as other fans of our shows, other fans of Writing for Roleplay, other fans of all the geeky stuff we are going to be talking about in the future. If you like this podcast, though, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share with a friend. After all, the most effective form of advertising and the most effective way to help independent creators is word of mouth. Check it out. Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knutson. It is edited mostly by Kevin because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff.
I have many skills. This is just not one of them.
We post a new episode of Writing for Roleplay every Tuesday. So until then, see you next week.
Bye!